Okay, so last week we talked about Halo Infinite and a 343 developer's time with the company as they worked on Halo Infinite, and they appear to be doing different environment pieces and artwork like the skybox, for example, and they had some comments that really blew up online, and I decided, hey, we'll take a look at it here, we'll go over it, and I'll do my best to kind of clarify exactly what they are saying and my opinion on that with the game. So I made the video, kind of moved along, didn't think too much about it after that. But interestingly enough, Eric, who was the person who made the comments, actually emailed me. It came through at like 1:30 in the morning later on that night. So I didn't really see it until like the following afternoon when I started to actually dig further down into my inbox for that time. But he sent over a pretty lengthy email going through all of the different points that were made in that Reset Era translation. And I started to kind of go through this, and I was like, all right, that makes sense, sure. Everything he was really pointing out was basically said in my video. In fact, the video I made originally aged pretty well after this email went out and he was working to clarify it. Then some people linked to me his video on the entire situation, and I watched it, and I said, okay, I think I understand what happened here, because it does appear that some of the comments he made were interpreted differently by media outlets, websites, and maybe even other YouTubers. But I figure we would talk about that here today to help amplify his video that he put out to explaining everything and kind of just going over all of his clarifications. Guys, if you enjoy these videos, make sure that like button helps out a ton. If you're new here to the Small and Wave Plus channel, make sure you subscribe down below. Okay, so one part, some people told me I should take down the original video. I don't think so. I think it was actually pretty good, and you're going to see why that is here in a minute. So we're going to jump over here to the email that Eric sent over. He said it was fine to share the email. No problems there. And I think this email was pretty much sent to anyone who touched on this story. So it does appear that I'm sure plenty of places updated some of their articles, some probably didn't, but for the most part, I think there has been clarification making the rounds, but nonetheless, I wanted to kind of touch on it here. So this is from Eric, where he says, starting at the top, I am not a Halo news source. And I do agree with that, because as I said to start the video, this is from a single person's perspective in 343, who's made up of hundreds of people working on Halo Infinite. You need several sources from all different departments if you are going to put together a full report and story on what's happening at 343. So I was very careful to clarify that in the beginning. And I also mentioned that Jason Schreier appears to be backing some of this stuff up, because it sounds like he is going to be releasing some sort of write-up or article or report around Halo Infinite's development along with 343. Now, one part that was very difficult to take, obviously, from written comments that were posted around, is that he was genuinely happy in this studio. I mean, it is hard to say, obviously, when you don't have tone or context to some of these comments that were shared in bullet point format, but it's good to hear he was having fun or a good time working with Halo Infinite. I imagine that is a very good resume builder. I mean, if you think about it, like, you're working on what's like Microsoft's flagship brand, their franchise. So being able to put that on your resume going forward when you want to do other work for other studios is probably a really positive thing. So good to hear he was happy working with that. But then he goes on to say, the game being overly ambitious, that's my feeling toward this game. It's an opinion. Yes, there is content being cut and changed, but that's part of every game development. Same thing for many other forms of entertainment. This shouldn't surprise anyone. In fact, that's exactly like what I said in the video, that stuff gets cut all the time. That's why we always look towards these beta builds of different games that maybe were shown at like an E3 or behind closed doors to see what was changed and altered, just really to see what couldn't make the cut. Like an example would be Cyberpunk was supposed to have wall running, but that was pulled out, obviously, because they weren't able to make it work maybe in the world with the gameplay, who knows. But yeah, things get cut all the time. To go a little further here, he says, don't expect it'll be a masterpiece. Again, my opinion. We're in the day and age of games that can get hyped up so much, and fans starting to have unrealistic expectations about it. Doesn't mean it's not going to be a good game. I stated in the video, I will look forward to playing it, and I will always support this game because I know how hard people worked on it. And once again, that is exactly what I said in my video. I said, we're to the point now with these AAA big budget games over the last 10 to 15 years where expectations have stacked one on top of the other, to where a game like this that is being made by hundreds of people with a massive budget that's rumored to be upwards of $500 million it could come out and be great. Like it could come out and everyone's like, wow, this game is really fun. I'm really enjoying my time with it. But on Metacritic, it gets like an 88. And people are going to look at that and say, it's not a 90 at least. It's not a 93 or something. And because of that, it's still going to be seen as not living up to those unrealistic expectations. And that's just kind of the reality, this AAA gaming space that we have created with these expectations. In fact, I fully expect Halo Infinite to be a very good game. It's probably not going to be a genre-defining game that people have kind of set themselves up for with something like this. So most likely, the game's going to come out, be very good, but still somehow find a way to disappoint. And that's just kind of the reality we're in now with games of this size. Goes on further to say engine is a defect. This is a misleading way to say this. What I said is the engine still needs updates. There are still improvements to be made, but again, that happens to every game engine. Unreal Engine 4 still have updates despite they announced Unreal Engine 5 already. Yes, we were a bit late on the starting line in engine development, but like I said, it's getting better every day. And once again, that's what I said. It was created from the ground up with the idea of using it for Halo Infinite so that they can extend the Halo franchise further. They were using an older engine. It's probably run its course since they've been using it since like the start of Halo, basically. So creating a new engine unto itself is difficult. But then also, developing a game using that same engine alongside of it is even harder because you're developing the game using the engine that's being worked on and being changed based on what you need in the game. And as updates are happening, you could break one or the other. And after a time, you're going to have enough updates stack up to where the engine and the game can more coexist in development over time because a lot of those issues have been discovered and fixed. So obviously at this point, I'm like, well, basically everything being clarified here is exactly what I said in the video. And then I got to the bottom of this and this email and I realized something. I feel like a lot of outlets kind of honed in on the last sentence, and it's a word that Eric never used. And it was mostly added in by the person who translated these different points that Eric made and kind of at which point they put their own interpretation in with more straightforward quotes, basically, right? So a lot of outlets appeared to run the headline about crunch at 343. And crunch is a word that you do not want to be associated with if you are a developer, like how Eric is. And he mentions things like, I see a lot of people working hard, right? Maybe overtime at times, right? And crunch has kind of taken this very vague statement now where instead of saying, okay, crunch should be something about unhealthy work hours where you got the sleeping bag next to your desk because you just cannot leave the office. You're going to be there all week through the weekend trying to get this thing done, whether it's a level that needs fixing with different bugs or testing or anything like that, because you have to meet a deadline and you're being leaned on heavily, whether it's by crunch culture or just management saying you can't leave, right? Like that is the crunch that should be focused on. And as Eric himself points out here, okay, I really need to clarify that I've never said there was a constant crunch, nor did I say I was forced to crunch. Everyone crunch over midnight for a different reason. Some could be the deadline, but many of us just want to go the extra mile to do the best we can. Sometimes an artist got into a good groove and just want to continue. I sometimes got really into what I was working on and I forgot to eat, and I was eager to finish it while I got that momentum going. Whenever that happens, an artist could easily lose their sense of time. Either way, I really need to clarify that I wasn't forced to crunch, and it's definitely not a constant thing. And I think this is something, once again, that was picked up by the media, and it was a good headline grabber. There's a reason I didn't put it as like the title for my video, because it was such a small thing that was obviously added by the person who did the translation. And now I assume because we have so many headlines, which I'll show you here, Halo Infinite 343 accused of crunch development by former employee. I understand why Eric sees these headlines and gets anxiety or frustration, because if you start being attached to these kind of things, right, as someone who's pointing out a developer that you worked for, right, a development studio like 343, and you're saying, well, they're making their employees crunch, as this headline basically says, a lot of studios are going to look at you and say, well, there's the liability to hire because they're throwing around that word for something we're not making our employees necessarily do. Okay, now, do I believe that a lot of AAA studios, developers for these big AAA games do crunch? I mean, at this point, I just assume there is some form of overtime happening that can be labeled as crunch. The question comes into, is there crunch culture that then kind of holds up unhealthy working condition and hours? That's the thing that I think needs to be focused on in gaming, because if you start talking about working a couple of hours of overtime as crunch, it kind of loses its impact, right? Overall, if we start thinking any form of overtime is crunch, then it starts to take away from what is severe, unhealthy crunch and how serious it should be taken. But like I said, Halo Infinite's 343 accused of crunch development by former employee. Former 343 employee says Halo Infinite being made under crunch conditions. Former Halo Infinite dev talks cut content, crunch, and more. They have a little update there for Windows Central. So I believe Windows Central did at least update their article with the comments that Eric made here. And Halo Infinite former 343 Industries dev clarifies recent statements regarding crunch and cut content. So good news there. We did have some of these websites kind of talk more about what was said after those initial translated comments came out. So I do understand why Eric had issues with the way it was covered by some media and outlets and all of this, but it was such a small thing at the bottom, and it was of course spun by the person who translated it, that I didn't really feel the need to go over it much more than 30 seconds to a minute. And even when I did go over it, I kind of talked about how, hey, this is Eric, or one person at that time, seeing like maybe some people work a little harder, and crunch is something that should be looked into more with several sources across a company, or really a development studio, the size of 343. And that's why when Jason Schreier writes an article around crunch, he doesn't show up with like one anonymous source. He shows up like 10 to 15 and a ton of different instances that took place, so that he can really hold up the idea of unhealthy crunch or working conditions at that company, because you need a lot of evidence if you want to start throwing that word around. And I think that's the way it should be, because otherwise you then diminish the severity of it. But let me know what you guys think about this one in the comments down below. I'll also go ahead and leave a link to Eric's video going over all of this so you can hear it in his own words. I'll leave that in the description down below. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.